Good morning, everybody. Dr. Fisher here. Hopefully you can hear me. I put in headphones this morning because there's construction outside. So today I wanted to talk about a really fun, easy topic, and that is grief. Before I start, I want to show you something fun, something that my staff left me. And it's a great little way. I was on vacation, and let's see if I can get this to work. But when I showed up this morning, here is the wonderful, hilarious view of my little table. This may be true, but what a fool's joke. So, when we talk about grief, I am referencing Brené Brown's book, Atlas of the Heart. Grief is something that I work with very, very closely with so many patients because grief is part of our everyday. Let's see if that, hopefully we're back up and running again. So we can connect with our emotions and process them. In the book she talks about the idea that, for example, it's just like a car. Like if your car broke down and you're stuck on the side of the freeway and you're not a mechanic, you're like, oh crap, what am I going to do? So you call somebody who knows something, they tow you away and take you to a mechanic. And if you were a mechanic and you're stuck on the side of the road, then you open up the hood of your car and you look at all the details, and then you're able to determine what's going on. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to give you better information to know more of what is happening in your own mind, in your own heart, in your own soul, by giving you information about and education about what emotions are, because grief can get you stuck. It's a really, really easy thing to get stuck. Now, there are a lot of different variations of grief, so I'm going to show you a chart that I use on a regular basis. I use the 5 stages of grief. It's pretty simple, where we start with this idea of denial, isolation, and then once we're out of denial and isolation, we pop into anger. And for those of you who've worked with me enough know that anger is usually a secondary emotion. So there's usually a hurt or shame or abandonment or rejection or something underneath there. You flip back and forth, right? And as you see, these kind of back, boom, 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 they're back and forth. So it's not really that simple, but this is a simplistic version. Then we go from anger, then we go to depression. And depression is more long-term, sadness is more short-term, bargaining, we're kind of back and forth. But our goal is to end up in this place of acceptance so we can have as much ability to kind of continue moving forward. And as Brené Brown talks about here, she talks about integrated grief. That's where we want to end up, acceptance and or integrated grief. So I wanted to spend a few minutes on this idea of what is grief, right? Because grief is not a singular situation. It's not one point in time. Grief actually has lots of parts to it. So the more that you understand all the parts involved, the better you're going to be able to process your grief and allow you yourself to recognize when you're getting stuck in grief so you can move forward. So she talks about this in the very beginning of this process where she says, grief is often thought of as a process that includes many emotions rather than a singular emotion. And so for a long time, research was suggesting that, grief may be more of a linear process. But what they're finding is it's not really a linear process. It's kind of like an ingredients list in relation to baking a cookie. Or, well, we made cookies over the weekend, so that's why I was thinking of cookies. Whatever you're going to make, there's an ingredients list. And so for grief, there's an ingredients list. So the more you understand the ingredients, you can recognize when you're feeling them. Okay? Now, it's really, really important too, because oftentimes we get stuck in this idea of grief. So the more that we're able to connect with this, and why is this important? Let me say why this is important. When I work with people, and the goal is to be able to help them change their lives, empower them, allow them to move forward, oftentimes there's grief related to change, right? So as you get healthier, there's going to be a lot of grief letting go of the old you, right? The old you has to die. I know that sounds extreme, but that's just the way that it is. So as that process moves forward, the more you're able to know these things, the more you're able to see them. You're not going to get overwhelmed. You're going to be able to say, oh, that was lost, that was this, and connect with it, process it, and move forward with it. Same as if a mechanic was stuck on the side of the road and he's going to go and look under his hood, he's going to say, it's that part. I know where it is. I know what it's going to take to fix it. Yes, I'm going to tow it to my shop. I'm going to fix that piece. I'm going to be back on the road again. No problem. Okay, so it is an inconvenience. There's a lot of pain and suffering involved. There is energy involved in this process too, but we can move forward with it. So, with that being said, we're going to talk about the 3 components of grief, okay? And they are loss, longing, and feeling lost, okay? They sound similar, but they're actually different. Okay, so let's start with loss, right? So for example, she uses the example of, while death and separation are tangible losses associated with grief, like you literally physically lost that person, their ability to be there with you. Some people identify loss as more difficult to identify and describe. And that makes sense because loss is associated with all kinds of different things. Okay, so for example, loss of normality. So what you're used to, right? Maybe waking up with the person next to you, or having a conversation, or spending time with that person when you're visiting your kids or whatever. You lose that from a normality perspective. And so that's going to be a loss. Okay, so that's one part of it. Longing. So not only don't have that person there and you have a loss associated with that, but you have longing, right? Longing is not a conscious wanting, right? It is an involuntary yearning for wholeness, for understanding, for meaning, for the opportunity to regain or even simply touch what we've lost. And it's a really, really important part of that grief, and it's part of the process. And so one of the difficult parts is longing is one of those things that's a very vulnerable piece. And it's very difficult to connect with people, but to connect with people about your longing is one of the most healing and important pieces that a lot of people get stuck in, myself included. Okay? And she goes on to say that's usually the reason why we keep it to ourselves is because we feel like we might be misunderstood or perceived as being engaged in magical thinking or unrealistic thinking, or lacking in fortitude and resilience. Right? So we don't want to be perceived as those things that might make us appear weak or not able to move forward in our lives. And then the next piece is feeling lost, right? So grief requires us to adjust. So feeling lost, I kind of think of it like I was getting down off of a high cabinet the other day. I'm remodeling my kitchen, and I was trying to touch the stool, and it was too far away. And so I was trying to put my foot into space, and it was like, ah! It feels kind of like that, right? Not being able to reorient and reconnect with that part. Now, she goes on to say, grief requires us to reorient every part of our physical, emotional, and social worlds, right? It is a struggle. It requires a tangible change. Especially, again, if somebody dies or they move away or you get divorced or some part of that. So it's oftentimes these things are hard to articulate and express, especially if they're so overwhelming, right? The longing and the loss and the feeling lost to the people around us, right? It's difficult to express things to people. And the more disconnected and alone we feel, the more that grief takes hold of us, the less we're able to process, the less we're able to move forward. And oftentimes, it's really, really hard to see your friends or family in a place of grief. And so I got to tell you, if you're seeing them and you're saying, oh, get over it, or, oh, you're so sick because you're still grieving over that person, that's not going to be helpful. What needs to happen is that person needs to be supported and seen to the best of your ability. And if you don't have capacity to do that, maybe refer them out to a professional. That's a really, really important part, right? Grief is complicated, and any of those things can happen at any time, and they bounce around. Now, she goes on to say, each person's grief is like a unique fingerprint, and that is 100% accurate. Now, I like to try and help people see patterns where they can recognize this part or this part or this part. It's kind of like, okay, so eggs and flour and sugar and salt. Okay, so you can recognize each part of those things, and then you know kind of how and where to use them. So grief is the same way. Now, grief comes in different stages as well. Another variation of this is acute grief, which is in the short term, right? It's kind of like your house is burning down. Integrated grief is another term that she talks about, in the sense of, again, I mentioned that earlier, integrated grief is this result of you adapting to the loss. Now, that doesn't mean you're going to forget the loss. That becomes part of your existence so you can move forward with it. Complicated grief is one of those situations where it becomes difficult and things get a little muddy and the adaptions are a struggle, and the person... So one thing that she points out that I want to be real clear here is she talks about complicated grief not being depression. Depression is not complicated grief, people. And complicated grief is not depression. It's a different variations, right? So complicated grief is that feeling like that person may appear, you wanting to connect with that person and they're not necessarily there. And the last thing I want to talk about is this idea of disenfranchised grief. So what is disenfranchised grief? Disenfranchised grief is a very, very difficult one. It's not as much in the literature. It talks about all of the different aspects that may be taken away with things like sexual trauma or divorce, or survivor's guilt, and those sorts of things, where there's a lot of kind of these weird pieces where people, for example, sexual trauma survivors, they go through a transition in their worldview that the world's not safe. They don't trust people anymore. They lose part of themselves. They lose part of their self-value. They lose some of their freedom and some of their independence. And that safety and security that they lost, which some may also lose some of that sexual interest component, which then may also be a part of and affect their relationships in the future, both with themselves and their partners. So this is a very complicated process, but it's really important to understand all the details that go along with it. So the more you can understand those details, and the more you know them and you recognize them, the better you're going to be able to process and move forward in your health and be able to find that place of integrated grief, find that place of acceptance so you can continue to move forward. You can honor the relationship that you have with the people that you lost. And that will allow you to move forward and be healthy and pull out of a stress response and repair and recover and take back your life and live the life that you want to live, which is ultimately what our process is about. Helping you live the life that you want to live in health and power. And so this is your thought for the day. This is Dr. Fisher signing out.